All right, so this presentation is picking up partway through chapter 3, where chapter 3 starts to really dive into the details of definitions. And remember, a word is just a string of symbols. Itself is a symbol. It's made up of other symbols. And then that word, that symbol, has a specific meaning. And if we're competent users of the language, then we kind of have a pretty good understanding of what these symbols mean, what these words mean. But if there's some debate, or if the word is ambiguous, or it's vague, or it's just unfamiliar, then we want to lean on these definitions to give us a knowledge of exactly what these words really mean. And that's, of course, important because these words are going to make up sentences, they're going to make up statements that express a proposition, and we're going to need to be able to assess whether those propositions are true or false. And in order to understand whether the proposition is true or false, we have to know what the words mean. So definitions, right? And I talked about this in a previous presentation, so let's kind of move on. So here's a distinction that's going to play a big role coming up here. So the extension of a word versus the intension. And first of all, I want to draw your attention to what these do not mean, how we're not using extension and intension here. And I've got it sort of in the fine print at the bottom of the screen. So when we're talking about extension, we're not talking about making something longer. That's sort of the way it's used in common language, but extension here has this very specific technical meaning, and this is the way we're going to use it in this presentation. And then intention, notice the intention that we're going to be using has got an S, it's S-I-O-N, but the intention that it ends in T-I-O-N, that is, your intentions, your hopes, your desires, your plans, or something like that. So that's what we're not going to be using here. Instead, the extension of a term, is the way we're using it, is all the things that the term applies to. And I've got an example coming up here in a moment to make it even more clear. And then the intention of a term is referring to the properties, or the set of properties that a thing must have in order to belong in the extension. So, for example, think of the term bird. What's the extension of the term? Well, it's like all the actual birds, right? All the birds in the world are the things that are in the extension of the term bird. So yeah, it's an obvious list here, all the robins and finches and penguins and eagles and woodpeckers and emus and all those things, that's the birds. But an intentional definition would provide a list of properties of birds. So being feathered, being an egg layer, being warm-blooded, all those sorts of things. That could be quite a long list. It could include sort of genetic characteristics and genetic relatedness somehow. So if you have those properties, then you properly belong in the extension of the term bird. Okay. So this relates to definitions because there are sort of two general categories of definitions. There's the extensional definitions, which use examples. They just sort of list examples one way or another. And then the intentional definitions that provide the properties that things must have in order for that term to apply to them. So it turns out intentional definitions are sort of the more interesting ones. They're the more common ones. So I'll just do all the extensional ones in just a single slide here. We've got three different subcategorizations of extensional definition. So first of all, an ostensive extensional definition. This is pointing to, or sort of presenting, things that belong in the extension of the term. And so this is a common way that you help very young children to understand a term, a new term. So for example, let's say you're just trying to explain to a child what rocks are, and you just point to, like literally and physically point to individual rocks, or you pick up rocks and you show them to the child, and you say rocks, or a chair. It's like you point to a chair and you say chair. So it's this sort of gestural definition, right, where you're physically doing something. There's a strong non-verbal component to the definition. We're not really going to be using that much at all in this class, but it's worth mentioning. An enumerative definition is sort of like an ostensive definition, except that you're verbally listing things that are in the extension, as opposed to just physically, gesturing at them or physically presenting them as you sort of say the word. So you're just listing them, writing them or saying them. And if it's a relatively small group, if the extension is relatively small, then it might work out to provide a complete list. So for example, let's say that you were wanting to define the Supreme Court of the United States. It's like, well, there's a variety of ways that you could do that, but one way you could do that is just to list all 9 justices of the Supreme Court. And so that would be a complete enumerative extensional definition of Supreme Court of the United States. More typical, though, is that the extension is really big, and so it's just impractical or maybe even really kind of impossible to list all the things. And so instead, you list just a small subset of the objects or the items that are in the extension. And that's actually what I did for the extensional definition of bird. So let's go back up here. Bird includes, and then I gave a list of birds, right? And you might notice I tried to give an interesting and useful inclusion. So we've got regular flying birds, robins and finches, those sort of prototype birds, but also penguins, flightless birds, swimming birds, predatory birds, all different kinds of birds. So this is a, if I get back to it, yeah, an incomplete enumerative extensional definition for bird. And fairly useful because I gave a good representation of all the different kinds of birds. So it gives you a pretty good sense of what birds are. Another one, I won't talk too much about this one, but definition by subclass. So you sort of describe what groups this thing is referring to, especially overlap between groups. And in the book, they talk about how this is particularly useful for terms whose extension is empty, right? There are no actual objects or actual things in the world that are in the extension of this term. They might be imaginary things, for example. So one example that they use is unicorns. So how would you define a unicorn? How would you give an extensional definition of a unicorn? Like, well, they're horses, kind of, right? But more than just being horses, they're horses with a special sort of central horn on their head. Maybe they have wings too. Yeah, I won't really bother saying too much more about that because it's not that common of a definition style. Okay, moving on to then the intentional definitions. And as I mentioned before, these are much more common, much more useful for our purposes, especially in this class. So, and there's 4 different sort of subcategories here that I'll go into more detail on all of them. But remember, an intentional definition, this applies to all 4 of these. It's going to include the properties of the thing that we're talking about, the thing the term is referring to. So first of all, lexical definitions. This is like what you typically would find in a dictionary. You could also call them a conventional or an established definition, an established intentional definition of a term. So this is sort of the rough and ready. We kind of understand, if you don't know what a word is, you look it up in the dictionary. It's not going to give you like a complete and comprehensive understanding of the concept. It's going to give you a rough and ready ability to be able to understand what this word means when people use it in natural language. And in many cases, it might actually be pretty vague. And so maybe it's not super useful when trying to establish the specific meaning of a proposition that's being used in an argument. I counsel my students in my other philosophy classes to not rely on dictionary definitions in their essays because just getting the conventional usage doesn't give you sort of everything that you need to know in order to really understand this term and what it really means. It just tells you how it's used. Notice too, though, that these kinds of definitions can actually be assessed as being true or false. The definition itself could be true or false because there is a specific way, a specific convention for how these terms are used in the regular language. And then it's either the lexical definition that's provided is either accurate, right? Either is an accurate reflection of the way that this term is actually used in regular language, or it's not. So the definition could be a true definition, a true account of how this word is used, or it could be a false account of how the word is actually used. And you might need to update your dictionary. Okay, next one, stipulative. So this is sometimes useful, especially in sort of technical situations, like in science or mathematics, where you've got a word it's got a conventional meaning. We kind of understand what it is, but we want to use it in a specialized way in these special circumstances, like a scientific context. And so we come up with a stipulative definition to nail down exactly what this term means in this context. And this is also really common for new terms, like whether it's a new term being used in science that just came up with this new word, or a new term that just shows up kind of in popular culture. So for example, the term work, right? That's got a conventional meaning. It's sort of what you do in your job in order to make money. But in physics, the term work has this very precise meaning that's been stipulated by physicists. It's distance over time. So in order to, when I said that, I was like, wait a second, is that actually the stipulated definition of work? So I quickly looked it up. That's something I should have known, but when I was speaking in the moment, I realized I maybe got it wrong. So yeah, in physics, work is stipulated the stipulative definition of work is force multiplied by distance. And so that plays a specific role in their mathematical modeling of physical scenarios and how they calculate predictions and those sorts of things. So it's got this very special stipulated definition that's different than the conventional definition of work. Same thing for some new terms that have shown up, like black hole in physics and astronomy. It's got this very specific definition. It's like a regular word, that you might see a hole in something and it's dark, and so you call it a black hole. But black hole in astronomy has this very specific stipulated definition that's based on Einstein's general theory of relativity. Then for new terms, in popular language, so a good one I think is selfie, right? So that's a term that's relatively newly introduced into our language. It's got the stipulated definition. It sort of rose up naturally, but there was this thing that was happening, people taking pictures of themselves, and it needed a word, right? We needed to have a term that applies to this new thing, and so we just stipulated it. Selfie means, taking a picture of yourself, typically using your cell phone or something. Another one might be dab, right? This particular gesture that people make after achieving some kind of a success, or a slow clap, especially in like teen movies. There's the slow clap at the end when, the hero is sort of acknowledged for doing something good, and it starts off slow and gets faster. That sort of a thing. Or, slow clap is sometimes also stipulated to mean kind of a sarcastic clap, like, oh, good job. All right, so that's the stipulated definitions. Now, next one, the precising definitions. This is when you take something that's got a regular conventional meaning that we understand, but it's a little vague, right? And, in order for this to work, for our purposes here, we need to come up with a more precise definition of this. So a good example that they use in the book is death, right? We understand what death is. You could look it up in the dictionary if you wanted to get the conventional meaning, the lexical definition for death, but it's vague, right? When let's just say, talk about a human, when the human is dying, sort of, different parts of their body might shut down at different rates. This organ is shutting down, but the cellular activity is still continuing in a different part of their body, and parts of their brain are maybe fading out or something. So it's vague. Like, when does death actually happen? Well, in a medical situation, in a hospital, they might need to record the time of death, like in an emergency room or something. And so they need to know, like, so what is it? Like, what time are we going to put down? We need to know when the death actually happened. So they have a precise definition that's a bit different than the conventional definition, and it has to do with brain activity and organ activity and so on. And once you cross that precise threshold, boom, you're dead. Right? And then they record that time. Okay. So theoretical definitions. These are sort of the toughest ones, but in some ways the most important ones, especially for philosophy and also for science. So the idea here is that beyond the lexical definition, the conventional definition, or any of these other styles, a theoretical definition is intended to give you a complete understanding, really a full understanding of exactly what this term is, how to use it, what things should belong in its extension, what things should not belong in its extension, so that once you've got the theoretical definition, you can sort everything in the world exactly correctly according to what belongs in the extension and what doesn't. In philosophy, we sometimes call this conceptual analysis. So we take a concept, this term that's referring to a specific concept, we zero in on that concept and we think, so what are the elements of this concept? Let's take the concept itself and pull it into its individual parts and see what that concept is made of so that we can get a really complete understanding. Or there might be a scientific theory that is the basis for this definition. So there's something that we sort of understood already. We had a conventional definition, we're referring to something all the time, but then in come the scientists and they start to study it. They're like, okay, people are talking about this. Let's like really study what this is. And it might take years, decades, or centuries for them to do it, but eventually the idea is that they'll come up with a theory, right? A scientific theory, and be able to very clearly define exactly what this thing is based on the theory. And so we'll have some examples coming up soon. Well, we already had one black hole, like a black hole. It's got a theoretical definition in addition to sort of a precising definition or a stipulative definition. Okay. So a theoretical definition should be able to provide us with the necessary and sufficient conditions for being in the extension of that term, right? So what are the properties that something needs to have to belong in the extension? So a necessary condition is a condition or a property that cannot be missing in order for something to belong in a certain category. Then a sufficient condition, or really, usually it's done in the plural, right? What are the sufficient conditions? That's the set of conditions, the set of properties that when are present in an object or in some item, that allows that thing to belong in that category. It allows that thing to belong in the extension. So here's a real common example that gets used all the time in introductory philosophy classes. So consider the concept of a bachelor. Right. So if you just look it up in the dictionary, you might see something like this, a man who is not and has never been married. Like, okay, that gives you a good sense, right? That's a rough and ready understanding of what it is to be a bachelor. But it doesn't really give us the full set of necessary and sufficient conditions. It sort of hints at them, right? You've got to be unmarried, right? You've got to be a man. But it doesn't really give us the full understanding or the full ability to be able to accurately sort everything in the world into the things that are bachelors and the things that are non-bachelors. So for example, it doesn't say that one of the necessary conditions is that you be alive. If you're dead, you can't be a bachelor. That's not what bachelors are. They're not dead people. They have to be alive. Now it's sort of hinted at when they say man, it's hinted that we're talking about adults. But if we're going to provide like the full, like a very clear set of necessary and sufficient conditions, we have to make it clear that we're talking about adults. So a brand new baby boy, they're not a bachelor. That doesn't make sense to call a baby boy a bachelor. It certainly doesn't make sense to call a baby girl a bachelor. And so adult, mature one way or another is what we're talking about here. Human, they don't bother mentioning that. Again, maybe that's implied a little bit by saying it's a man, but it's got to be human. Let's make that really clear. That's a necessary condition. If you're not a man, that is, if you're not a human, you can't be a bachelor. Dogs and cats aren't bachelors. Trees aren't bachelors. And you have to be unmarried. That was included. That's a necessary condition. You have to be available for marriage. So that's not included, right? So think of the Pope. Is the Pope a bachelor? It's like, that's not how we use that term bachelor. That doesn't make sense to call the Pope a bachelor, but he is a man who is not and has never been married. So that shows a limitation of the lexical definition. But we're doing a better job when we come up with the full set of necessary and sufficient conditions when we include it's got to be available for marriage. That is somebody who hasn't taken a vow of celibacy and a vow to never get married, because then they're sort of taking themselves out of the category bachelor. And there might be a variety of other conditions. If we really wanted to spend a bunch more time on this, we could like get more and more precise, more and more detailed as to what is the full set of necessary and sufficient conditions. And then we would be able to perfectly reliably sort everything in the world into the things that are bachelors and the things that are not bachelors. So here's another example. It's not so much just sort of a philosophy example in this sort of social category of being a bachelor. It's a sciencey example, temperature. And in fact, I think it's good for, as an example for all the different kinds of intentional definitions that we've been talking about. So if you just look it up in the dictionary, what is temperature? You might see something like this, being or feeling hot or cold, or amount of heat. Okay, that's a pretty good reflection of how we use the term. What's the conventional usage of the term temperature? But it's not giving you sort of the full understanding. Maybe it's a little inaccurate in some ways. So if we were to provide instead a stipulative definition of temperature, which is actually, if you sort of look back at the history of the understanding of temperature and the scientific study of temperature and heat and so on, this was a definition that has been used. So the definition of temperature involves affecting a thermometer in a specific way, like causing a column of mercury to rise or fall by a certain amount. Well, that doesn't really tell you what temperature is, but it is very precise, right? But it's a stipulation. We've got this measuring device. It just happens to include columns of mercury and little ticks on the side of the glass tube or whatever. And so we just stipulate, this is how we're going to use the term temperature. It affects a column of mercury, makes it go up by a certain amount, by certain degrees. Okay, then also if you look at the history of the study of this topic, you will see that it wasn't very well understood for a long time that there's actually a difference between when what we're talking about in terms of temperature and what we're talking about in terms of heat. Those are closely related things, but they're not exactly the same thing. And it took a while. It was really kind of into the late 1700s or so and into the 1800s before it was fully appreciated that these are distinct concepts, temperature and heat. And so a precising definition could be that. It's where we distinguish what we're talking about with temperature, and it's distinguished from heat. Because before it was a little vague, it's ambiguous as to what exactly we were referring to with the term temperature. But then, once scientists had studied these things even in more and more detail, we had the molecular theory of matter and atomic theory. We came to understand that everything is made up of atoms and these subatomic particles. And so when we're measuring temperature, what we realize is that any substance is made up of these little particles, and these little particles are always moving. In air or water or something, they'd be moving all around, but even when they're in a solid, and so they're not moving from place to place, they're still moving, they're still vibrating all the time, always vibrating. And so it turned out that when we're measuring temperature, what we're actually measuring is the average kinetic energy of the particles that make up the substance that we're measuring. That's what temperature actually is, right? And it took a scientific theory, in fact, sort of overlapping scientific theories, to give us the full scientific theoretical definition of what it is to be temperature. And so that sort of gives us the full understanding, the absolute understanding of what temperature really is. Here's another way that people construct definitions. It doesn't necessarily automatically neatly map into the previous categories of definitions that we have, but as they call it in the textbook, definition by genus indifference. So a genus, in the way it's being used here, is just some class, some group of objects that all share properties, share a certain set of properties. And then a species is, as they call it, a proper subclass. That is a smaller group within that genus, within that larger group, and it's completely contained within that larger group. And so we talk about a group, the genus, and then we identify a subgroup by pointing out some specific difference that that subgroup has compared to all the other members of that group. That maybe sounds a little complicated, but the examples are simple. So let's say that you wanted to define what a kitten is. Well, what's the genus? What's the group, the main group that kittens belong to? It's like, oh, well, they're cats. But it's a subgroup of cats. And what's the difference that distinguishes this subgroup of cats from all the other cats? Like, well, they're young, right? They're immature cats. And so a kitten is a young cat, right? So that's a simple definition by genus indifference. Similar for stallion, right? It's a horse, but specifically it's a male horse. Or boy, here we've got to identify two separate differences because it's not good enough just to be young. It's got to be male as well in the group humans. And so a boy is a young male human. Nothing fancy going on there. Okay, so then the next thing to talk about is a variety of problems that can show up with definitions. And in the textbook, they talk about this primarily in terms of problems with these definitions by genus indifference, but these problems can actually show up in any of the categories of definition styles that we've already been talking about. So here's the whole list, but I'm going to go into each one of these in a bit more detail and give some examples. So a definition that's too wide. So if your definition is too wide, then the extension that's picked out by that definition includes things that don't belong in the extension of that term. So for example, let's say that you define humans, and this is sort of like the genus indifference thing, a bipedal animal, right? Bipedal means you walk on two legs. That sort of picks out humans. Humans they're animals and they do walk on two legs, but so birds, right? Of course, birds fly, but when they're on the ground, they walk. And there's maybe some other non-human mammals or other animals that might do a similar thing. And so this is too wide. It's including way too many things in the extension of the term, the things that don't belong in the extension of human. Similarly, if you define a car as a wheeled vehicle, like, well, that's getting close, but it includes too many things. It includes things in the extension of wheeled vehicle, includes things that are wheeled vehicles, but they're not cars. Like motorcycles, bicycles, and a wide variety of other things that are indeed wheeled vehicles, but they don't really belong in the extension of cars. So that's too wide of a definition. Okay, so too narrow goes the other direction. It picks out an extension that's too small, right? It leaves out things that should be included in the extension of this term. So let's say that you're trying to define what it is to be an animal. You're thinking about animals, and you think about birds, and you think about fish, and you think about horses and people and dogs and so on, and they're flying and swimming and running and all this stuff. So you're like, it's an organism, it's a living thing that's capable of locomotion. Like, okay, but it turns out that there are some animals like sea anemone, shellfish, like mussels, they can't locomote, right? They can't move around in that way. And so this is too narrow. It's excluding things from the category animal that should be included because they are in fact animals. Or bird, here's a famous one, right? Birds, animal with feathers that can fly. Like, okay, that does a pretty good job, but it is too narrow because it's excluding penguins and ostriches and other flightless birds. Okay, so here's another problem that the definition or terms in the definition could end up being too obscure, ambiguous, or figurative. So and I've got a bunch of subcategories here that I'm going to go into and give some examples, but the general problem here is that the terms in the definition themselves need to be defined in order for us to have any idea what the definition is saying. So for example, you ask somebody to define some term you're not familiar with, and they just start throwing all this technical jargon at you. And that's not helpful, right? You don't know probably what all that, if you didn't know what the original term was, you're probably not going to understand any of this technical jargon. And just as a side note, oftentimes people that might indicate that the person themselves, they don't really understand what the word means. And they're just trying to obscure that fact and make themselves look smart, even though they don't really know what they're talking about, by just overwhelming you with technical jargon. So yeah, that's unfortunately a common practice. And so if somebody can't explain something, if somebody can't define something using understandable language, then you might wonder whether that person themselves even really understands what they're talking about. Anyway, so here's some examples. And so let's say for some reason that you needed a definition of duck, and we're talking about the animal here, not, like ducking your head down to avoid something about to hit you. So somebody might say, oh, a duck, well, that's any member of the Anatidae subfamily. Okay, well, if I didn't know what a duck is, am I going to know what the Anatidae subfamily is? Probably not, right? So that's not a useful definition. Just technical jargon. This other one, this has been used a lot. It's like people sort of playing little tricks on each other, playing a verbal prank sort of. But if you, for whatever reason, ask for a definition of water and somebody says, oh, that's dihydrogen oxide. Okay, well, if you're not a chemist, you might not really know what that means. And so that's not a good definition. You could use rare vocabulary. That's another problem with in this category of too obscure, ambiguous, or figurative. So let's say that somebody defines a hat. It's a sartorial accompaniment affixed to one's pate. Like, okay, that sounds pretty fancy, but not that many people maybe know what sartorial means or what pate means. And even if they did, this is like unnecessarily sort of pretentious, right? Like, why would you use that definition? You're just trying to make yourself look fancy without being helpful. And so this is the kind of definition to be avoided, right? Because you got to define the terms that are here. And there's a better way. There's a clearer, more straightforward way of defining this term. Here's another one. This is where the terms that are used in the definition are ambiguous. Remember, an ambiguous word is one that has distinct, two or more distinct meanings. And so if somebody, this seems like a pretty good definition of faith. It's true belief. Like, okay, but this term true here actually has ambiguous meaning. It can mean more than one thing in this context. It could mean that it's like it's a real belief. I really believe this. Like, I truly believe that this is true. That this is the case. Or I truly believe that God exists, or something like that. This means it's a sincere belief. Like, it's a belief I actually have and that I hold strongly. Or saying something is a true belief could mean that sort of the content of my belief is accurate. So I might say that I believe that the background of this slide here is blue. Well, the background of this slide is blue, so my belief is true, right? So I have a true belief about the color of the background of this slide. So saying that faith is true belief in and of itself, that's ambiguous. And we need to then ask, well, what do you mean by true here? And so maybe this isn't the best kind of definition to provide for faith. Metaphorical or fanciful language. This is great for poetry or other kinds of literature. But when we're talking about definitions and specific arguments, and we're trying to evaluate whether the argument is valid or cogent, this kind of a definition is absolutely not useful, right? So this term art, which actually, by the way, it might be like kind of impossible to come up with necessary and sufficient conditions for being art. It's notoriously difficult to define, but this is a particularly unhelpful definition, right? Art is the stored honey of the human soul, gathered on wings of misery and travail. Okay, so is the Mona Lisa art or not, according to this definition? I have no idea. And so it sounds fancy. It can be great, like I said, in poetry or literature or whatnot. But in an argument, like, this is a terrible definition for art. Yeah, so here's another one. This is one that they had in the textbook. So desire. What is desire? It's the actual essence of man, insofar as it is conceived as determined to a particular activity by some given modification of itself. Well, this has lots of problems, right? It's figurative, first of all. It's also got some technical terms in there, essence and that sort of thing. It's ambiguous, throw in vague as well. There's a lot of problems here. So again, like, maybe this does sufficient work. It's a good thing to include in some work of literature, maybe, but completely unhelpful. Just making yourself sound sort of fancy without actually conveying any useful information. Okay, moving on. So another sort of category of how definitions can go wrong. And this is one you've probably seen before. A definition could be circular. And so a definition is circular when the definition includes the term that's being defined or some grammatical variant of the term that's being defined. So here's one that I like. Some of you might know where this circular definition is coming from. So excellence is defined as the quality or condition of being excellent. It's like, okay, thoroughly unhelpful definition, right? If you didn't know what excellence is, then saying that it's the quality or condition of being excellent is not going to help you. Or metaphysics. This is one that a lot of people don't know what that is. So, oh, metaphysics is the study of metaphysical issues. Okay, well, now we're just right back where we started from, which is, what are metaphysical issues? Like, give me the real account of what metaphysics is. Okay, so here's another one where the definition, it might be sort of correct, but it's phrased in terms of a negative way rather than positive. That is, it's describing the properties that something should not have in order to belong in the term's extension, rather than describing the properties that a thing should have to belong in the term's extension. So, if we want to define life as the state or condition of not being dead, okay, yeah, like the things that are alive are not dead, but it seems like we've got some positive properties or characteristics we could provide to give an account of what living things are like. You know, this doesn't tell you what living things are really like. Or one they have in the textbook is a mineral. Oh, what's a mineral? It's not an animal or a vegetable. It's like, okay, so this is telling us what's not in the extension of mineral, but it's not really giving us a good account of what is in the extension and why those things are in the extension. What properties does something actually have to be a mineral? This isn't telling us. So this is not a very good definition. Here's another one. I kind of like this one. Ones that are technically correct, but they're kind of dumb, right? They're useless or irrelevant somehow. So if somehow, you know, somebody wanted to know what chocolate is, and I say, oh, I know what chocolate is, that's my favorite flavor. Okay, but that doesn't really explain what chocolate is to anybody who doesn't know what chocolate is already. I mean, it is my favorite flavor, so this is true. It's a correct definition, but it's not an informative or useful definition. Here's, I've got a couple other examples. This one I like too. So iron. Oh, so what's iron? Oh, that's the element between manganese and cobalt in the periodic table. Okay, great. This is sort of like, making it negative rather than positive, but it is technically correct, but it's useless. Like, this doesn't tell you what iron is. It just sort of tells you its position on the periodic table. Or you could give the number, right? It's number whatever on the periodic table. Okay, well, I guess that's technically correct, but it's not useful. Some other ones, they had this in the one book. If you define 7 as the number of days in a week, that's a weird definition of 7. It just so happens that the week does have 7 days, but that doesn't tell you what 7 is really. And this one we saw before too, right? The human is a featherless biped. Like, well, yeah, humans are featherless and they do walk on 2 feet, but that doesn't really tell you what humans are. Okay, so if a definition that shows up in an argument violates any of those things that we were just talking about, any of those 6 problems, then it makes it very difficult to assess the quality of the argument. First of all, the premise might just be false, but it could also be that it's just not, we can't evaluate it as being true or false, because it's, like the figurative language ones, where it's all this fancy vocabulary, and we're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, and so we can't even evaluate that. And so the premise might just be useless, and maybe we just eliminate it, or we just throw up our hands and we're like, yeah, we cannot evaluate whether this argument is valid or cogent or anything, because the definitions being used they're just bad. They're just bad definitions one way or another. Here's another way that definitions become relevant in assessing the quality of an argument, especially when an argument goes wrong. There could be a problem of equivocation, as they call it. So equivocation is when a term is used more than once in an argument, or just in a single statement, but the term has different definitions each time that it's used. So here's an example, right? It's a dumb example, but it kind of gets the point across, I think. Jim increased the volume of air in his lungs, therefore Jim made the airs in his lungs louder. Like, okay, well, volume is, we're equivocating on sort of how we're using this term volume. What definition are we relying on? The first one, we were talking about volume of air in his lungs. Well, that's capacity, right? That's a space in his lungs. But in the second one, making it louder, like, well, that's volume in terms of loudness or quietness. And so we've equivocated on what we mean by volume here. And we end up with a really dumb argument. Here's another one. This is from the textbook. So I cannot trust Jim to fix my computer. That means I can't trust Jim. If one cannot be trusted, then they are dishonest. Therefore, Jim is dishonest. Okay, we've equivocated on the term trust here. Like, what's the meaning of trust? The way it's used here is sort of being reliable to accomplish a specific task. Whereas down here, the term trust is being used in terms of like telling the truth or lying. It could be that Jim is perfectly honest. He never tells a lie, but he also doesn't know anything about computers. So you're not going to trust him to fix your computer, right? And so this is a bad argument because we've equivocated on this term trust. Another thing that can happen when you sort of zero in on the definitions of the terms being used is that it can expose what turns out to be as they call it, a merely semantic dispute. So two people are sort of arguing, there's a debate that's going on, it looks like it's a real debate, but they're actually agreeing. They're just using different words to refer to the things that they're talking about. So let's say we've got some argument where, Ned, this person is saying that, oh, caring for others, that's the greatest virtue a person could have. But then Bob says, wait, no, actually it's compassion. That's the greatest virtue that someone could have. So it looks like they're disagreeing what the greatest virtue is. But if we ask them to define caring for others and compassion, it might turn out that they're actually talking about the same thing. The meaning of those terms is the same. And so they're talking about the same thing being the greatest virtue. They're just using different words to refer to that thing. So that turns out to be a merely semantic dispute. Here's another one. Poor Ned and Bob just can't get their words straight. So Ned says, oh, the boat was pitching back and forth. And Bob says, that's impossible. Boats can't throw baseballs. Okay, that's dumb, right? Sort of a joke. But, we've obviously equivocated on the meaning of pitch, right? Where Ned is thinking of the term pitch as like the angle of the boat, right, is swinging back and forth, whereas Bob is using it as throwing a baseball. Okay. Another problem with definitions that can show up in arguments is the definition itself could be biased, right? It's biased in favor of a particular viewpoint. And it's not sort of the best definition that we could come up with. It might even be violating one of the above problems where, it might be relying on vague language or something like that. Or it's technically correct, but it's useless, or something along those lines. So here's an example. This is a common one that I hear. So taxation is simple theft. Like, that's what taxation is. And theft is immoral, so taxation is immoral. Okay, but that's not really the best definition of taxation. There's certainly all kinds of debate in philosophy and in law and in sociology, in political philosophy, all these sorts of areas. Think about what taxation is, and when you sign on, when you become part of a society, you agree to be helpful. You contribute to that society in one way or another to keep the society running, so that we have this whole community that's functional, and that might include agreeing to be paying taxes. And if you agree to pay taxes by being part of a society, then when the government accepts those taxes, that's not theft. That's just them, sort of gathering up the necessary funds to keep the society running, right? So that's the debate, right? I'm not trying to sort of establish a specific point, but the idea is that there is a significant debate behind this. And so if you just simply define taxation right off the bat as simple theft, well, then the debate goes away. You're just ignoring this whole interesting area of philosophy and area of argumentation. But if it really is just simple theft, well then yeah, it's immoral and probably shouldn't happen. But the definition, of course, is persuasive, it's biased, and so that shows how the argument goes bad. Yeah, here's another one. I've heard this one plenty too. So, you know, somebody might hear about how evolution talks about how one species evolves into another species, or every species that exists sort of evolved from a previous species. And so somebody might say, ah, so I know what evolution is. Evolution means that dogs turn into cats. Like, well, dogs are not turning into cats, so evolutionary theory must be wrong. Well, yeah, that's a terrible definition of evolution. In fact, as we'll see in a future chapter coming up really soon here, this is what they call a straw man fallacy. It's incorrectly defining the term here, the term evolution. But that's informal fallacies. They're coming up in the next chapter. So I will go ahead and stop there for now.